We'll start to take a look at the physiology of the heart, and in so doing, we'll do this by starting to take a look at what the heart needs in order to do what it does as a pump. So, the heart itself truly is, in a sense, two pumps. There are two sides to the heart itself. Remember back to anatomy, we have the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart. And the blood, in a sense, doesn't really mix between the two sides of the heart. And so, as blood comes back in from the circulation, enters in at the right atrium, and that's going to pump out through that side. So this picture kind of separates the heart completely into the two pumps themselves. And so we have the right side of the heart giving us our pulmonary circulation, and then the left side of the heart giving us our systemic circulation. And so that right side, as it goes from the right atrium to the right ventricle out to the lungs, we're going to pick up our oxygen there, increase the oxygen, get rid of the CO2 out of the lungs themselves, and bring back that oxygen-rich blood back to the left side of the heart. Now, the left side of the pump can then pump out to the rest of the entire body itself. And we can see some of that differences there as well when we look at the vessel or the ventricular walls. And in those ventricular walls, you can see that that left side is much, much thicker than that of the right side because it has to go out to a much larger area of the body. And so it's essentially pumping to the entire body itself, miles and miles and miles of blood vessels where we've got to pump that blood through. So kind of a more traditional type of a picture here in terms of the heart being back together now. But we can still see that we have our pulmonary circulation, and inside there we're going to increase our oxygen levels again, decrease our CO2 levels, get rid of the waste product that we have there, and bring back very oxygen-rich blood into the left side of the heart, and once again pump it back out to the rest of the entire body itself. And then there, we're going to decrease the amount of oxygen that's in the blood, increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the blood, pick that blood up, bring it back to the right side of the heart, and once again continue back into the pulmonary circulation, get that blood back to where we can get more oxygen once again. So this process is going on and on and on all the time. We're constantly pumping two sides of the heart, one side going out to the pulmonary circulation, one side going out to the systemic circulation. And this is where if we have problems out in the lungs, if we've got problems out in the peripheral vasculature somewhere, we're going to see issues in either oftentimes the left side of the heart or the right side of the heart in terms of backup of fluid and things like that. And we'll talk about that later on, especially when we start to look at the vessels themselves. So that heart is constantly pumping. It's always pumping, always pumping. 24 hours a day, it's constantly pumping. And so we have to think about it in terms of just even like muscle. In terms of its needs, just think about doing, say, like arm curls 24 hours a day, or even just doing arm curls at a restful pace, 5, 10 pounds, just 60 times a minute, 70 times a minute, depending upon heart rate of the person. So go kind of the average there and go 75 times a minute. You've got to do an arm curl of 5 or 10 pounds, depending upon how much you're able to maximally lift. So a third in a sense of what your maximum is. So if 30 pounds would be your max, you'd be doing 10 pounds, but doing that 60, 75 times a minute. And then at times you may even need to get that up to 150 times a minute. And that's what the heart is doing. So it needs a tremendous amount of blood supply. It needs a tremendous amount of oxygen and and glucose to get into the heart muscles themselves. The downside about this pump situation is that the heart can't get any of those nutrients from the chambers themselves. And so oxygen and glucose isn't coming right out of the chambers. And if you think about it, it makes sense because the right side of the heart is relatively oxygen poor. So where's it going to get its oxygen from? It's got to get it through the coronary arteries. And so the coronary arteries are where we're going to pull that oxygen from. So it has its own blood supply. And so just like any other muscle within the body, it has arteries that come into it. It has capillaries, it has veins, it has its own circulation within the heart itself. And that all arises from the coronary arteries. And so we have our right and our left coronary arteries supplying the right and left side of the heart. because of the way that those, if you remember back to anatomy, because of the way that those vessels are situated, um, the majority of that blood is going to actually have to come in during diastole. And so because the valves there of the aortic valve are going to tend to cover up those vessels when blood is actually flowing out, it's going to then do most of its flow into the heart during diastole as the blood backs up into the aorta and then eventually goes out into those arteries. And that's there. And so depending upon the heart's needs at any given time, this blood supply is going to go into the heart and give it to it. And so here we have a casting of the blood vessels as they go into the heart. All of the red ones are arteries and all of the blue ones are veins. And so this is basically a process where they take this resin and pump it in through the blood vessels and get it into the blood vessels themselves, and either a red or a blue one depending upon whether we're looking for the arteries and veins. Pump that into a heart and then essentially peel all of the heart itself away, and so get rid of actually the muscle tissues themselves, and what we're left is this casting. And this doesn't even show the extent of that vasculature either, because this doesn't really show anything in terms of the smallness of all the capillaries and everything. So this is only getting down into some of the smaller arteries and veins that are coming into the heart itself. All the very tiniest of ones are gone from this particular casting. So we can't really see the nature. Otherwise, it would look like a full heart because there would be so many blood vessels inside there. And so here we can see the coronary arteries as they're coming off of the aorta there. And so it branches off there and then starts to come out to the heart itself as it's making its way all through and then coming down and branching, giving off branches, and going to all the different places in the heart itself, delivering all of the nutrients that it needs. So it's invaluable to make sure that those blood vessels are well working, so that they're not allowing for any kind of blockage or anything that's there. And so this is where all of that changes that are there in terms of the branching and all of the vessels that go along, depending upon if we do have a blockage, depending upon where that blockage is, we're going to have potentially a large portion of the heart that is affected, because remember, we only really have the left coronary artery and the right coronary artery supplying the heart. And so if we block the left coronary artery here right at its origin, and so right as it's coming out from underneath the pulmonary trunk and before it splits into the left anterior descending artery here and before it goes over to the circumflex, that's going to block out all of that blood supply. So basically the entire left ventricle is going to be devoid of blood supply. It's going to lose all of its blood supply that it normally would have there. But if we have a blockage further on down, say in the left anterior descending here, or the left atrioventricular artery, as that comes down, or even down here, we're going to have a much smaller area of the heart that becomes affected. And so we don't have like a major heart attack in terms of those processes. We don't have a major infarction in the blood supply that's there. But that left anterior descending, the LAD, or the left atrioventricular, is one of the more common blood vessels where this does actually occur. And so we need to be able to recognize it early, recognize it soon. When people are starting to have those chest pains and things like that, the faster that we can reopen up those vessels, the more chance they have at not damaging the heart as much. And so this is just a image of what would happen as somebody goes into, say, the cath lab. So they come in with chest pains, they put them on an EKG, they see that they're having a problem there within the blood supply, and so they send them over to the cath lab and they discover this thinning of the vessel here. And so you can see that essentially the vessel is, in a sense, kind of large, and then all of a sudden it becomes skinny again, and then it gets large again. And so in that area of the blood vessel, there's a blockage. And so because they add a little bit of a dye into the blood vessels, so we've got a radioactive dye there, and as it fills the blood vessel, if there's a portion in that blood vessel that is thinner than the rest of it, we know that there's some sort of blockage. And so in order to fix this while they're in there, they can then go in and put in a stent, and now that blockage is open. And so the stent is basically going to go in and be kind of like a mesh cage inside there, and it's going to hold open that portion of the blood vessel. And so it goes in and essentially opens up the blood vessel, and it's like a cage, has all kind of a crisscross in there, and holds open the blood vessel itself. So now that blood vessel can stay open in that area. It doesn't really fix the true problem, but it at least allows for that blood supply to occur again. And so now the person's not going to end up having a complete occlusion there. Make some changes in their diet and exercise and things like that, and we can get that to come back from that point down. Next up, we'll start to take a look at the actual conduction processes in the heart.